that Russia needs to be an American puppet state. And if it doesn't agree to being a puppet state, we're going to keep putting pressure on it, and we're going to break up the Federation and so on until we have several different puppet states. And then they will all agree, because individually they won't be strong enough to resist. So he's very much aware of that. He saw this operate during the Yeltsin years, when Yeltsin essentially was a de facto agent of Washington and let Washington money take over Russia and basically loot the resources and leave these kinds of oligarchs in control. Well, when Putin came along and got elected, he began overturning all the advances Washington had made in turning Russia into a vassal state. And many of these advances occurred while Washington was preoccupied with the Middle East, with Saddam Hussein, the Taliban, bin Laden, Gaddafi, and they weren't on Russia's case all the time. And so he was able to restore the economy, restore the military, get the country unified. And what he's been watching is that every agreement that Washington made with Russia was broken by Washington. They broke the agreement not to move NATO to Russia's borders, not to move it east. They broke the treaty that Moscow and Washington had, the ABM treaty, in which both countries agreed not to develop protections against ICBMs, so that the ICBMs could not become a first strike force. They would always be a retaliation force. That makes the likelihood of nuclear war less than if you have ABM systems, because then you can run into the mistaken conclusion that you can strike the other person, but they won't be able to strike you because you'll have the ABM protection. So Washington pulls out of that. And this line of transgressions of Washington's against Moscow continue. And then we come to Ukraine, in which the government in Washington arranges to overthrow a democratically elected government. They use the Washington-funded NGOs, and they overthrow Ukraine. And the first thing they do, they announce nobody can speak Russian, and the right-wing elements start talking about cleansing the country of Jews and Russians. And this then terrifies the Russian populations in eastern and southern Ukraine, which were really never part of Ukraine. And they began their separatist movements. So
and Russia, and just so we know, Russia would be a fool not to be involved in eastern Ukraine, because they're scared of them turning Ukraine into a NATO state with missiles right on their border. So they have to be involved in the eastern Ukraine with the separatists. They'd be a fool not to be. I mean, what did Washington think they were going to do is my question. I mean, did they just think they were going to go, okay, fine, no problem?
Well, you know, the surprising thing is, Greg, is how little Russian involvement there's been. Because in Crimea, the people themselves voted to leave the Ukraine, and they then voted to reunite with Russia, because for centuries they're part of Russia, not Ukraine.
And you were saying they have the base there had 25,000 troops there under a treaty. They didn't invade it; they had their troops under a treaty. They were paying Ukraine.
And so when the Ukraine asked to reunite, Putin agreed, or the Russian government agreed. He's not a dictator. The Russian government agreed, which makes perfect sense. I mean, the Russians fought wars hundreds of years ago against the Tartars in order to get Crimea, so they would have a warm water port. It's the only access they have to the Mediterranean. So, but then you see the government in Kiev that Washington installed. This is not a Ukrainian government. This is a Washington government. We put it there. Well, Washington put it there, not you and I. That government began attacking the other separatist provinces. And the Russian government kept saying, look, don't do that. Just talk to them. They just want some kind of autonomy because you're speaking in such hostile ways. You're taking hostile acts against Russians. And don't go in there and bomb civilians and use artillery against apartment complexes. Stop that. That's just not going to lead anywhere. But Washington egged it on and mandated it, and it continued until the people in the eastern part of Ukraine, who are also Russians and were formerly part of Russia, said, we're not having this, and they formed their own militias, and the war started.
And it's not over. I mean, even though it's
not over. Now,
and Putin is also, just one other thing I wanted to say, which I find very scary, is that he's talking about how it's not good for you to blackmail Russia, and it's not going to work, and you're not going to be able to isolate us. Those are, with all the Ebola scare and all that stuff going on, I mean, this is a nuclear-armed country talking about U.S. and the West blackmailing Russia and trying to isolate them. That sounds like war talk or potential war talk to me.
Well, I think it's not Putin making war talk. What he's doing, he is, and this is what I was giving this long prologue up to show all the things he has witnessed. You know, it wasn't Putin that brought NATO to Russia's borders, that violated the ABM treaty, that overthrew the government in Ukraine and so on. He's been watching all of this move against Russia, and now he was thinking perhaps that the Europeans would put a halt to it because it's not in their interest. But they haven't. And so now he's saying, look, you're pushing too far. You're pushing too hard. We're not just, because we're reasonable and unprovocative, doesn't mean you can walk all over us. And don't get the idea, just because I haven't slapped your face, that we're going to permit this forever. And you've got to understand that you're being very, very aggressive against somebody who can stand up to you. And we're prepared to do that. We're not Libya or Iraq. We can stand up to the United States. And you should factor that in before you keep giving us a hard time. We're not giving you a hard time. We're not doing anything. We're being very patient and cautious and unprovocative, and you keep pushing. And you've got to understand that we can't take this forever and won't. So that's the message that he gave. And I think it's a very reasonable message. And what's so amazing is it just didn't play in the American media.
Which is why I contact you. I'm thinking,
I don't even think
he's sending out he's beating the drums and sending out flares saying, warning, danger, hey, you know, you're getting close to the line here, and he's not like Obama. They're going to cross the line, and he's not going to hesitate. Obama's going to hesitate. I tell you what, I wouldn't want to. He's not going to ponder and take a poll if he has to do something.
Well, I think he's just saying what I said, that you're going too far, you're getting carried away with yourself, you don't have that much power. And why don't you use diplomacy? We keep offering you diplomatic solutions. We keep trying diplomatic alternatives. You never respond. You just ignore us.
And put more sanctions on, right? It's the beginning of the ceasefire.
He says Russia arranged a ceasefire in Ukraine, and the same day you put more sanctions on. Now he says the sanctions don't bother us. What bothers us about the sanctions is it shows your attitude. You're totally unwilling to work anything out. That's our complaint about the sanctions. Here we go. we stop the war for you, and you come back and hit us with more sanctions. Now that tells us you have a very mean attitude toward us. Of course, we already know that because we've been watching this for 20 years.
Well, and particularly the last couple of years.
20 years is enough, is what he's saying. 20 years of your bullying. That's it. No more.
And let's move down to this whole ISIS, Turkey, ISIL, Islamic State, which I've been saying since, I don't know, the first of the year. I've been saying since before that we were arming the rebels who were Al-Qaeda, at least in part. I mean, John McCain's got his picture taken with top Al-Qaeda figures in Syria. And at the very least, we helped arm them along with Saudi Arabia and other, Middle Eastern countries. And now it's blowing up in our faces. And now Turkey's saying, hey, we'll help you, but we have to destroy the Islamic State and Assad. I'm thinking, well, we're back to Russia. We're right back with they're diametrically opposed forces, the Islamic State and Assad. They hate each other, but now we got to take them both out. That to me is just another hotspot problem that could blow up with Russia. I mean, ultimately, am I wrong?
Well, I don't know. I think Lavrov's speech at the UN on the 27th of September, when he pointed out that, this is a direct quote, Washington has openly declared its right to unilateral use of force anywhere to uphold its own interest. Military interference has become a norm, even despite the dismal outcome of all power operations that the U.S. has carried out in recent years. In other words, the United States has not had one success. They overthrow Libya by bringing in these jihadists.
Yes.
And now not only is Libya in chaos, but the jihadists have now gone to Syria. We sent them there to overthrow Assad, but instead they've decided to remake the borders in the Middle East. They're creating a new state, partly out of Iraq, partly out of Syria. We've lost control. We now have a new enemy that's our own creation.
It blew up in our faces at the very least. Some people say it's a CIA.
Not only that, Greg, but the Taliban now say they're uniting with the Islamic State.
Well, wonderful. Just what we needed.
So after 13 years, we couldn't defeat the Taliban. I mean, we're just going to bleed to death over there. We're already bankrupt, busted, and they're talking about carrying this fight on another 30 years. Who's going to pay for it? The Americans working part-time jobs at Walmart?
Yeah, that's what Panetta said. 30 years.
Yeah.
30-year war.
Who's going to pay for it? Do they think they can print money for 30 years and the world won't flee the dollar?
Which may happen sooner than later.
It may happen real soon. So, I think the Russians are looking at it and just saying, well, they want to bury themselves in the Middle East. We'll just let them.
Well, let's talk about what you just said about the dollar. Do you think that the dollar could could suffer a panic selling attack? That's what John Williams says ultimately is going to happen. People will just dump the dollar. They're looking at the stock market now. Look at the economy that's not so good. All the numbers are basically bogus, from unemployment to GDP, you name it. And is the world getting ready to dump the dollar, the stock market, the Treasury bond market, poof, the whole thing at one time, in your estimation, being a PhD in economics and former assistant Treasury secretary?
Well, that doesn't give me insight into the minds of all the countries. I think on the whole that there is a risk of it being dumped all at once, but it's going to be dumped anyhow, even if slowly. And it's already started. When you see the Russian-Chinese agreements and the Russian-Indian agreements, what you're witnessing is people moving away from using the dollar to settle their internal balance of trade between one another, their bilateral balance of trade. And so the demand for dollars is dropping for that reason alone. Now, if this market problem the last few days continues, and the Fed ends up saying, okay, we're going to have more money printing, that'll put more pressure on the dollar. On the other hand, if they say, no, that's it, not printing anymore, that removes some of the pressure, but it doesn't remove the departure from the dollar. The reason Russia and China and India and other countries don't want to use the dollar is because it gives the United States power over them. You can't put sanctions on countries that don't use your currency. So, and also, if you use the dollar, you have two foreign exchange fees to pay. When you take your currency to trade into dollars, to get the dollars to make the payment with, you have to pay a fee. And then the country that receives the dollars, if it wants its own currency, has got to go pay a fee to transfer the dollars back into its currency. So it's costly to use the dollar, and it's easier for these countries just to say, look, our currencies are just as good. The dollar standard grew up after World War II when no other country had an economy but the Americans. We all have economies now, and we don't need the dollar. So I think that is going to develop regardless of whether the Fed continues to print money. So the dollar is going to go down, whether it's sudden or whether it's just slow and gradual. And with the dollar goes the biggest part of American power.
Pretty sobering, my friend. Do you think we have some kind of a seismic? Do you think this Ebola thing? I said this on Coast to Coast. I said, well, even if the Ebola thing doesn't get to a full-blown crisis, if people just think it's bad, look at the headlines, whether it's the New York Times or whether it's Drudge or Zero Hedge or multitudes of other Fox News, MSNBC, everybody's talking about all Ebola all the time. We've had 3 victims, which I think is going to go up, 3 or 4 victims here in the U.S., but I think that's going to go up. But let's say it doesn't turn into a full-blown crisis and people just think it's a problem. They cancel airline tickets. They don't go shopping at the malls. They don't go out to eat. Couldn't that, affect the economy that's already not so hot?
Yes, it certainly could. You know, the incompetence of the public health officials and the hospitals to let hospital personnel who've been treating Ebola patients go get on airplanes and travel. You have to wonder about it. You see, it's so stupid. It's caused a lot of people to say this is all a plot to get rid of us.
It's hard not to think that. It's, as Jim Sinclair at JS Mindset, Mr. Gold says, is saying it's too stupid to be stupid. I mean, they don't know about quarantine.
Yeah.
The first line of defense, quarantine.
Yeah, and they continue the flights in and out of West Africa. So it could easily be the case that there'll be more of these cases. And what will happen is what happened the other day in Paris when a passenger was suspected of having Ebola, and the plane landed. They just kept it sitting there. And in came teams to test and question. And so what could cause people to stop traveling, whether or not they're fearful of Ebola, is what could stop them traveling, Greg, is the inconvenience. If somebody on the plane has a cold or a cough, and they say, oh my gosh, it could be Ebola, and then all of a sudden you're trapped there until they go through the whole mechanism. You've missed your connecting flights, everything. This can cause people to say, well, it's not worth it. It's too uncertain. Who knows? Not only might I get exposed to Ebola, but whether I do or not, I have an even greater chance of being delayed while they try to clear things out from some suspected case. I may sit on the runway for 2 days while they wait for tests to come back. These forms of involuntary quarantine it can cause people to say, I'm not getting on a plane. So that's entirely true. We'll just have to see what happens. You know, the nurse that they let fly, they're now looking for the 132 passengers. But what about the thousands of people that the 132 have already been exposed to? How are they going to find them?
It's unbelievable. I mean, it's just...
And so if it really is serious, it's probably already out of control. And the authorities, the public authorities, don't seem to have a grasp on it, and they have some old understanding of Ebola, and the current strain doesn't seem to be behaving in the same way, but yet they can't adjust their procedures, they can't adjust their way of thinking.
They can't even do a quarantine. I mean, that's just the first line of defense. That's what Kenya, that's what Nairobi. Oh, hey, we beat it because we shut the borders down, we quarantined. I mean, anyway, it's unbelievably, at the very least, it's incompetent, and it may be evil. I don't know.
Yeah.
I can see why people have these conspiracy theories. And then I just want to move on. Oh, go ahead, your thought.
No, I haven't anything else to say. I think it remains to be seen what kind of crisis this turns out to be.
And finally, why the Internet is thriving and they're laying off people at the New York Times and other places is because people lost their trust in the mainstream media. And up pops a story, and you've written about this, that there is a German journalist that said, I was a paid CIA asset. I was there to write fake stories. And, you've been saying this, and you were a former, people don't realize this, you were a big-time editor at the Wall Street Journal. Yeah, this is something you also know something about. You have a very deep resume. So the media's role and its just the people's distrust in the mainstream media is off the charts.
And justifiably so. William Colby, the CIA director, bragged once. He said, "There's no significant journalist that the CIA doesn't own." And years before I was the Wall Street Journal editor, I was in the congressional staff. We took for granted that the Washington Post was a CIA asset.
Oh, you're kidding.
No, I'm not kidding. And that's confirmed by Colby's claim. He wouldn't say that if it weren't true, because I'm surprised he said it at all. But
Hubris.
What the German journalist says is, he says, it's not just me who was a CIA asset writing stories for the CIA. It's all of us. All of us, he says. Everyone. We're all doing it. And he describes how they're recruited. The German Marshall Fund, for example, is one entry in. They get sent to America on expense-paid trips, and they're introduced to the right circles. And he describes, I posted an interview with him. He describes how they recruit you and wean you into the system, and then you end up being a propagandist for Washington. He says, I was a propagandist for Washington. And that the media like that, it's all of them. They're all like that. It's not just me. I'm not just talking about me. And he says, I've got all the names. I keep waiting to be sued, but nobody sues me because I've got the names. I've got the proof. So I think and that's what we've seen. Now, I attributed this. I mean, I've known there have always been CIA assets in the media. But I attributed the complete collapse of the media to the Clintons allowing 5 mega firms to take over the entire media in the United States. And I've attributed the European media always representing an American viewpoint because that's what their governments do. Their governments don't have independent foreign policies. They follow Washington's foreign policy. So that was my explanation. But now he goes beyond that. he says, well, that's all true, but they also pay us. We work for them. We don't work for Germans. I was paid to lie to Germans.
Well, and which brings me to this. You may or may not like what I say, or people may or may not like what you say, but I can assure you, I'm not paid by the CIA. And I can pretty much speak for you that you're not paid by the CIA. Which I want to just tell people that
he's talking about the print media and probably the TV media.
Yeah, well,
so he's talking about the print media. He's not talking about the internet. They haven't gotten to us yet. They have trolls. They use trolls against us.
Yeah.
Yes. All these CIA, Mossad paid trolls who slander me everywhere on websites. I'm sure they do the same to you.
Yes,
they do. Anybody who says anything strong, they won't discredit.
Now, anybody that's even-handed, I try to be even-handed. I try to get both sides out. And you're just no. I put their side. I try to be. Anyway, I mean that's what you're supposed to do as a journalist, right? Be objective, put both sides out. And if you don't like their side, you put it out, right? Anyway, listen, I want to say this, that you live and die on your donations at paulcraigroberts.org, and you put a lot of work, and if people should be donating to your site to keep you going. I don't even think you even have Google ads or any way to, support your site.
No,
so
we don't take ads because it just overwhelms the site.
Yeah,
and not only that, then they start trying to control you through the ads.
Well, they put stuff up. I have Google ads because I'm trying to make a living off this, but I don't have any control over it. I mean, that's all I got. And so, anyway, well, listen, Paul Craig Roberts, paulcraigroberts.org. I'll put a link to your site at the bottom of this interview. Paul Craig Roberts, thank you for the multiple updates about the Ukraine, the Russians, the markets, the Federal Reserve. Oh, one last thing, gold. One last thing.
We didn't get to the markets, Greg.
Oh, well, the markets are well, let's I'm going to extend it right here. So the markets, gold had taken a big dive down. The markets were going up. Now it looks like gold's coming back up. The markets are plunging. What do you make of this gyration in the stock market and the gold coming back up?
Well, the market regained today most of its loss in the morning. I think what's happening is clear to me what's happening. It's not just what I think. It's clear. The plunge protection team arrests the decline in the market by going in and buying Standard & Poor futures. When they go in and purchase S&P future contracts, they drive the prices up. And as far as I can tell, there's no limit on the Fed's ability to create money. They create trillions and trillions and trillions and trillions. And so I think that if this contraction in the market that began the other day is real, and it's not just some temporary fear of Ebola or what's the Fed going to do or something like that, if it's real, it's being delayed and arrested by manipulation through the purchase of S&P futures. Because if the market's trying to go down and somebody's buying up a bunch of futures contracts, that all sets the falling prices, pushes them back up. And the same thing happened today that happened yesterday. In the morning, the market's falling apart. In the afternoon, it keeps coming back, coming back, coming back. And I think, excuse me, I think if someone were to look, they would see, all of a sudden, huge purchases of S&P futures. The same thing happened today. The market fell out again this morning and spent the afternoon coming back. And, of course, there have been a lot of interventions against gold. We've discussed this many times, and the way they suppress the gold price is instead of buying gold futures, they sell them.
They do the opposite.
They can, the bullion banks, the big banks that are agents for the Fed in gold, they can print up all the futures contracts they want and go dump them. They're not covered because they dump them in the market in which the contracts settle on a cash basis. And hardly anyone ever asks delivery, so they don't have to cover the contracts. So they can sell a contract of gold and when they don't have any gold. because the person that buys it is speculating and is going to settle in cash and is not going to want the gold anyhow. So you have then the authorities in the stock market supporting it by buying futures, and in the bullion market, they're undermining it by selling futures. So the markets it's just amazing manipulation. Now, if you and I were doing this, we'd be arrested. Instead, the authorities who are supposed to enforce the laws are the ones who are doing it. So there's no one to stop it. So it'll go on until either the crash in markets is so large that they can't arrest it, or until the dollar goes. Now, I've always said the whole system is rigged. It's a house of cards, and the weak spot is the dollar, because they cannot print foreign currencies with which to buy dollars. So if there is a worldwide run on the dollar, they lose control then. In the meantime, they have all these things they can do to counteract the direction of markets. And I expect them to continue doing that.
Could they just run out of gold? Could they come to a point where they just said, we can't deliver? That's what some people are saying is going to happen either late this year or early next year, that the inventories are so low and so rigged and everything is so manipulated, I should say, and the inventories are so low that at some point they're going to throw their hands up and say, sorry, we'll have to settle in cash, or sorry, we don't have it. We don't have the metal. And when they don't have the metal, they lose control of the gold market. Do you think that's a possible scenario?
Well, a lot of people think that, in particular ones who think there's no gold left in Fort Knox or in the New York Fed. They think all that's been lent out and used up. And if they're right, then the policy they have of naked shorts and gold to drive down the price, that just increases the demand in Asia for more bullion. And so if that's true and they haven't got any way of making these deliveries, then they're producing the crisis for themselves by holding down the gold price. Whereas if they let the price rise, it might temper the demand for gold in Asia and remove that problem. I think, as I've told you before, the reason they want to hold the gold price down is they're afraid of its impact on the dollar.
Everything comes back to the dollar.
And the reason they started suppressing the gold price, they had to protect the dollar from quantitative easing, because they were printing trillions and trillions of new dollars, and this was worrying people around the world who hold dollars, because the dollar was increasing, but not the goods and services from the American economy. And so when the gold price took off, the Fed said, well, look, this endangers QE, because if the dollar is declining in value relative to gold, it must also be declining in value relative to other currencies. And once the exchange rate starts collapsing, we lose control. So we got to suppress gold. So that's the way that is. I don't know which side of this equation will play out first, whether they'll run out of gold to deliver to India and China, or whether people will say this is a rigged scheme and we're just not participating anymore. You know, the Chinese have established, as I understand it, in Shanghai, a new gold exchange. And they have a futures market. But you cannot sell a naked short. If you want to short gold, you've got to have the gold in your possession. So they can't rig the price. Now, will this cause all the action to move from rigged market to a valid market? In which case, COMEX would no longer mean anything. Nobody would use it. So these things, I don't know how they'll play out, Greg, but we keep seeing developments that indicate that people are not content to play in rigged markets. Just like Putin is no longer content to play in America's bully world. You've been a bully long enough. We put up with it. We don't want any more. Well, I think that's what countries are starting to conclude. So I think that what the United States did in the 21st century was to destroy its reputation. It destroyed its reputation as a truth speaker, as a compassionate country, as somebody who plays fair and is even-handed, and who has a legitimate economy. Just completely destroyed the reputation of the country. And so since America had such an important position in the world, it takes a while for all the rest of the countries to reallocate their activities and their thinking and their behavior. And so, but that's underway. That's happening now. So I think we have crossed the Rubicon in terms of decline. I don't think we're going to go back up.